We've been doing this for a while now, fighting against the privatization of life itself. This is what the movement that many of us have been a part of now for more than a decade have been fighting for. Fighting to protect that which is too important to be left to the market. That's what we were doing 10 years ago on the streets of Seattle, and that's what we were doing before September 11th, when so much of our movement was derailed and we started fighting rearguard actions against wars and torture and battles that we thought we'd won. But in many ways, our movement is coming full circle. We're continuing that conversation that was so rudely interrupted, but we're also deepening that conversation, and we're learning from our mistakes. I feel a bit funny kicking off this incredible forum. I'm not an expert on climate science. I do know a little something about corporations and their tendency to take advantage of crises and disasters. And I do think that what we're seeing at the Bella Center is the biggest case of disaster capitalism that we have ever witnessed. And it is sad that this summit has turned into far more of that than what we would all want it to be. Despite the fact that we are all seemingly agreeing, denialists aside, and we have all of this urgency, and we've been told again and again this is the last chance to save the earth and all of this rhetoric, we know that what is being proposed in the Bella Center does not come close to addressing the climate crisis. It's not on the table. We have to be realistic about that. I think the time for naivete is really over, just sitting here and hoping and praying for a deal that is not on the table. It's silly. We know what's on the table. We know the paltry emission cuts that the Obama administration is talking about. 17% below 2005 levels, when science calls for 40% below 1990 levels. We know the levels of funding that they're talking about for deeply climate-affected countries. And they're insulting. They're insulting because we, in the rich world, are the ones who created this crisis. And on the most basic principle of polluter pays, or as Colin Powell liked to say before the invasion of Iraq, you broke it, you bought it. This is not about charity. This is not about more aid for the needy in Africa. This is about a crisis that we created through our consumption. 75% of the historical emissions that created the climate crisis came from 20% of the world's population in the developed world, in the industrialized world. According to the World Bank, hardly a radical source, 75% of the effects of climate change are being felt in the developing world. So there is a direct inverse relationship between cause and effect. We have just gone through this mass marketing of hope in the United States, and the whole world was roped into the Obama branding campaign. A lot of people have drawn comparisons between this moment, the moment that we find ourselves in here in Copenhagen and around the world watching Copenhagen, as being somewhat similar to the feeling in the air before those protests in Seattle exactly 10 years ago, when a new convergence, a movement of movement, was finding itself. We were finding each other. And what was unique about that moment was not that the movement was new, it was that it was many movements. It was this movement of movement. And in many ways, we had the World Trade Organization to thank for it because it was so ambitious. It reached into all of these sectors that had previously just organized on their own and didn't feel like they had to make coalitions or often had been pitted against each other, like the environment and labor. That's what was special about Seattle, the Teamsters and Turtles coalition. And it was the ambition of the WTO that brought those coalitions together. And it also pushed us to go beyond our single issues and to talk about economic systems, to talk about models. And there were debates at the time about whether you could even say the word capitalism, right? Call it corporate globalization. Don't say capitalism, it'll freak people out and the funders will cut their funding, right? So there were big debates about that. And there was a piece of graffiti in Washington, D.C. outside of a meeting of the IMF when there were big protests a couple of months after Seattle. Some anarchists wrote, if you think globalization is bad, wait till you hear about capitalism. We have a very, very different moment. Capitalism is on trial in so many ways. There is more distrust of this economic system than there has been at any point since the Great Depression. And in particular, there is a massive amount of distrust of the casino economy, of precisely the types of mechanisms that are being put forward at the Bella Center as the solution to the climate crisis. So, in other words, it's not that easy a time to be the ones trying to sell these so-called market-based solutions after precisely these types of complex financial instruments melted down the global financial system, and after we all saw what betting on commodity prices does to the price of food. Hey, let's do it to carbon, that'll be fun, right? It's a hard time to be them, but what has really been striking to me over the past year is that at the same time as public opinion shifted, not to where we were 10 years ago, but beyond that, with these open critiques of capitalism, where was the movement? Where was the mass movement that was responding to it? And that is what is changing now, because finally we're seeing the movement. And it's focused precisely on these false solutions, these market-based solutions, the insanity after what we've just witnessed of handing over the most pressing, challenging, terrifying crisis that humanity has ever faced to the very same people that created